If you were to ask 50 caster players on the ladder, you'd be met with a chorus of complaints about how melee is far easier. Apparently, they believe playing range is akin to performing Tchaikovsky, while melee, on the other hand, is like hitting pots and pans with a wooden spoon. Now, if you were to ask 50 melee players about casters, they'd counter by describing casters as slippery little insects who, despite the obvious incompetence, seem to possess an almost unfair amount of control, not to mention absurd amounts of DPS. In their view, playing a caster is about as difficult as breathing and nearly as brain dead. So who's actually right? Well, if you squint at the top of the ladder, you'll see it's practically bursting with casters. Seriously, the number of affliction warlocks in the top 50 is like discovering an entire army of goth wizards in your living room. Are these players just cosmic savants who are making those specs work? Or is it that melee is just a bit harder to climb with at the top? Hey, I'm Gelly, and you might know me from the AWC, where I've won a couple of tournaments and mainly have just lost the WoW for the past 10 years. And today I'm going to be talking about how I believe climbing as a melee and shuffler is actually harder than as caster. And before you start frothing at the mouth, I play most range classes at the top level, so you can be assured there's no bias from me. In fact, I used to believe the opposite for a very long time. Now let's get into it. Now when you play a caster, you're essentially wielding a Swiss army knife that has all the win conditions of WoW Arena in one neat little package. You've got crowd controls long enough to force cooldowns or score kills with, you've got burst damage, capable of sealing the deal in those crowd control chains, and you've got the luxury of positioning and mobility, allowing yourself to float around like a magician at a theme park, deciding exactly where the action takes place. The only thing you're really missing on most range classes is a Mortal Strike, which by going off the very high win-loss percentage of Demonology and Beast Mastery Hunters is a massive factor in Shuffle. However, thanks to the other benefits range have, this doesn't limit any range spec in the game, unlike one of those non-Mortal Strike melees like a Death Knight or Enhancer on the other hand, who have historically always struggled unless they are getting carried by a memes class like a Warrior or a Windwalker. The fact of the matter is, range classes have far more agency than most melee in the game, so when you queue up as a range, you know that the ball is generally in your court, and you can win the lobby if you play to the best of your ability. You can see this in action in the win-loss of the highest caster players versus the highest melee players, with most casters having close to 70%, whereas the highest melee, with the exception of rogues, are around 50 to 60%. Take this lobby for example. Most low-rated casters would say this is impossible to win. However, because I know I have the agency of forcing positioning and spammable crowd control, I actually came away with a 4-2, so I could consistently land fears on the healer to allow my melee to kill, despite dealing very low damage myself. And to back my point up from earlier, the Outlaw Rogue also ended up going 4-2 as they controlled the pace of the game and we were able to carry their team to wins rather than being the passenger class of Fury Warrior is, where you're simply shackled to how much DPS you can put out with not much room for device plays. Now I'm not saying that Fury Warrior or other melees are necessarily bad, mind you, and I'm well aware that at lower ratings you can quite literally turn on a rotation helper, plug in a USB bongo and slap it until you have your elite set, whereas casters have a far harder time dealing damage in lower lobbies as they don't know how to utilize a full kit or fake cast, sort of like trying to strum a guitar with a hot dog. However, as you climb the ratings, casters' true potential begins to emerge. Every ability becomes stronger as you learn to use it in several different ways. But melee, well, they're still just swinging that sword and trying to throw out their micro CCs, which is all just a bit limited. Which leads me on to my second point. There's really only one way to play melee and shuffle, and that is through pure aggression. Since dampening stacks so high and so fast in solo shuffle, melee can't just turstle until their cooldowns come back, like they are allowed to do in threes. Instead, they are strong-armed into brute forcing their way through the enemy team in a race towards a finish. Sadly for the melee, most ranged players are aware of this at high rating, and instead of competing in the race by playing aggressive themselves, they play true neutral, favouring defense over offense as the game will naturally come to a close due to either the melee making mistakes or the artificial healing decrease going up to an unsustainable level. Melees are on a timer to succeed, while range just have to outlive the clock until the second set of cooldowns comes back up. This creates a power dynamic where the range player quite literally just has to react to what the melee does, which is far easier than having to make conscious choices to actually win the game. When I'm on my mage, for example, I literally don't even think about how I'm kiting melee, as I'll literally have a tool to answer whatever they throw at me in the heat of the moment. However, when you play melee, you're not just playing against these tools, you also need to play against a guy playing the caster themselves and predict what they are going to use so you can pre-counter it, such as blade storming a knockback or vortexing a blink. Of course, we have yet to talk about the elephant in the room though, which is the fact that casters sort of need to do that whole caster thing which isn't really that easy these days of how sticky melee can be, although there is one tool that makes it a breeze, and that is positioning. Now positioning is actually super easy to get down as caster once you know how. However, for melee it's not so simple. It's basically like one of those 90s high school movies, where the bullies are standing in a triangle, throwing the poor school kid's bag around, and no matter where the victim goes, he can't reach his bag because the bullies are in the golden triangle position. And when there's two casters in a lobby versus a melee, this is really exactly the same principle. The melee player can't connect to anyone, meanwhile whichever caster is free is blasting him for unhealable DPS or crowd controlling his healer to no end. The melee's then stuck in a catch-22, where if they push in too far they die, and if they back off too far they are absolutely useless. Meanwhile, the range player is listening to their favourite EDM track and spamming their rotation out to victory. And although there is some melee favoured maps where this doesn't happen as easily, if you take a look at the map pool in Shuffle compared to actual arenas, you'll see that they are all caster favoured, except for Ruins of Lordaeron, giving all those melee players pretty terrible odds. Honestly, if I was Blizzard, I'd just remedy this by forcing Nagrand Arena, or at least add Dalaran and Hook points to some equal caster and melee maps. And as if a bad map pool isn't frustrating enough, I genuinely believe melees get hit even harder by terrible lobby RNG. Now let's be real, there is a massive lack of healers in solo shuffle, which actually is a huge detriment for melees. What I mean by this is if your healer player is on the weaker end, you as a melee cannot play the game. This is because the healer needs to push in with the melees and prioritize dispelling them and enabling them so they can go deep and stick to their target, which can leave the healer very vulnerable. This playstyle feels very unintuitive for healers, as they need to be aggressive, which is something that even the highest rated healer players struggle to deal with. On the other hand, playing with range classes is much easier for healers, because the caster doesn't have to do much to win, allowing the healer to just chill at their little pillar, barely moving all game. This feels far more comfortable and natural. Other than this, playing with worse healers is actually pretty good for casters, as they generally end up playing into the caster's strengths. They tank more spammable CC, they don't dispel dots, and they have a harder time dealing with spread pressure, all things that casters of any spec can easily abuse to get that 6-0. Most melee, on the other hand, can only really benefit from getting low-rated healers by dealing overwhelming single target damage, which is probably the gameplay factor that is the easiest to deal with for players just starting out. Now these problems wouldn't matter as much in other, more active games, however since there is such a healer shortage in WoW, and the role is often filled with people playing ults to get faster Qs, melees are suffering the most from getting subpar partners. This doesn't just go for healers, mind you, as low-rated casters are also pretty bad at playing with melees, as they don't enable them in much the same way, leaving melees getting pretty terrible lobbies pretty often. So what am I trying to say? Well sure, you can be a button-bashing Neanderthal on melee, and get your elite set or even enchant. But following through and getting legend is going to be far more difficult than a range class, as you're more at the mercy of your team and can't make those game-changing plays that every single caster is able to achieve. Well, that is unless you're playing a rogue, which do seem to be able to do everything a caster can do and more. So that's why I believe melee is actually harder to climb with at the higher ranks than casters.
Melee is actually harder to climb with at the higher ranks than casters.
If you like this video, be sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And if you want Brian or Ezreal back, just let me know and I'll put my webcam back in my drawer and go back to writing the videos on Skill Capped instead. I've been Gelu, thanks for watching.